Hi everyone and welcome. It's great to see so many of you here today. For those of you who don't know already, my company Instant Impact in-house recruitment experts. We work as an extension of our clients' HR function to provide the team expertise, marketing and technology that they need to make high quality, diverse hires directly. This webinar is the latest in our series on recruitment and HR best practices and the impact of global trends, and follows recent sessions on topics spanning improving diversity to remote onboarding. Today, we're going to be focusing on hiring for potential. We expect the webinar to last about 45 minutes and we'll send through a recording afterwards. If you have any questions, please add them to the Q&A box. We'll try to answer as we go through, and if not, we'll have a concerted period at the end where we can run through them. We'll also send through a feedback form. Your feedback's absolutely invaluable as we look to make our webinars as useful as possible, so it'd be great if you could take 2 minutes to fill that out for us. In terms of order of play today, I'm going to start us off by setting the scene and sharing some insights from the work that we do with our clients to restructure assessment processes to focus on potential. I'm then delighted that we're joined by our specialist speaker today, Roger Philby, who's CEO of the Chemistry Group, a business that helps companies to change the way that they think about what talent they hire and how to develop them. He'll be talking about how companies can better measure and harness human potential. Thanks again for speaking today, Roger. I want to start by talking about the purpose of the hiring process. Simply put, the purpose of any hiring process is to give yourselves the highest possible chance of hiring high quality candidates who will be a long-term success at your business. Companies that think about hiring the best long-term fit, rather than simply assessing candidates' abilities to do the job immediately today, give themselves a huge advantage. By not over-indexing the trainable elements in a job description and making sure that all of their requirements are actually requirements, they remove the barriers to high-quality candidates applying who might see one of the requirements and be put off from applying in the first place, thereby increasing their talent pool for every role. They can then focus their assessment on the attributes, behaviours and underlying skills that are needed for the role in the long term. After all, there are very few roles that a new joiner could walk into and be fully up and running from the first minute. They need to understand your processes, they need to work well within your culture, and ideally they need to grow within the role to add more value over time. The very concept of what we're trying to achieve in the hiring process is future facing. We're looking to hire the person that will be the best fit over the reasonable lifetime of the role. We need to focus on future performance. The issue is that traditional assessment processes, there are so many elements that we use to assess candidates that have very little to do with future performance and potential and focus more on the past. So if we look at a CV, the mainstay of many of our assessment processes, and in this case, a candidate called Robert, there are a number of different biases that come in from that CV. First off, we've got the halo effect, inferring ability from association with a previous employer. In this case, the view that if Robert worked at Google, he must be a strong candidate, without really knowing what he did there, or if indeed it was a good hiring decision for Google in the first place. Next up, we've got confirmation bias. Having already made the decision that Robert is likely to be a good candidate because he's worked at Google, we can then confirm what we think we already know. Whereas we may typically see a 3-month tenure in a previous position and have a question mark over why Robert left so quickly, we could infer that there must be a good reason that he left quickly if he was hired in the first place. Next up, we've got affinity bias, which is the unconscious tendency to get along with or recommend others who are like us. So in this example, if you completed the Prince 2 and you know how much it helped your career or how hard it was, you're likely to have a positive assumption about Robert's ability as a result of completing the Prince 2. Or in my case, we share a name, so he must be good. Then got stereotype bias. So Robert studied at Cambridge, so must be smart and good for this role. Or perhaps definitely more damagingly, look at the dates. He might be too old for this role. And finally, we've got a phenomenon called groupthink, which is all about where the CV came from in the first place. If your manager told you to review it or said that Robert looks like a good fit for a role, you're far more likely to agree with that assertion. All of these biases combine with others throughout the assessment process and essentially cloud our judgment when making hiring decisions. It's much more difficult to hire the candidates with the most future potential if we have all of those biases, and that's shown out in the academic research as well. There was a study by Schmidt and Hunter in 1998 and 2016 that you may have seen before if you've been to some of our previous webinars, which looked at how predictive different forms of assessment are of future performance. And what we can see here is that traditional forms of assessment, looking at the CV and looking at the years of experience and years of education, are far less predictive of future performance than work sample tests and general cognitive ability tests, which are much more forward-facing rather than backwards-looking. Although what you have done in the past is clearly a factor, it shouldn't be over-indexed in the hiring process. And if we look at a typical assessment process, it's clear that we have a bit of a problem that we are over-indexing those metrics. Typical assessment process would start with CV screening, looking at those years of experience and education, and often rejecting a lot of candidates that could have fantastic potential for a role right at that first hurdle. We then move to a telephone interview, which is typically unstructured and therefore less predictive than it could be if it was structured and properly backed with a full scorecard for that assessment. We then have the most predictive stage of a typical process, a panel interview structured around key skills, before a more informal meet the boss process and ultimately a reference check prior to offer at the end. To hire for potential, we can look at removing the components that aren't as predictive. So in this case, removing the CV screening, removing the references, at least if we're doing them before offer, and confirming that we are hiring the right person from the feedback from other roles, and removing the unstructured interviews. To put skills and productivity first. We can then rework the assessment process to start with cognitive ability tests, focusing on the skills and traits that you need for someone to be successful in the role. Then moving on to skills-based questions, which could replace that CV, focusing on how people would actually respond to real-life situations in the role. Maintaining then the structured interview with more than one person, and then looking to bring in other forms of assessment, such as a role play or a simulation or other forms of testing throughout the process, all again backed by that scorecard so that everyone's being assessed in exactly the same way. And as we'll come on to shortly, you're then collecting really valuable data when it comes to seeing how that potential lives out in the role. And finally, reference checks, which are obviously a key part of lots of processes, especially if you work in an industry where they're required to have certain criminal background checks. The point here is that we want to do those reference checks after deciding who we're going to make an offer to, rather than using it as an element of confirmation bias. If you're looking to become more predictive in your hiring, we would suggest that you have a look at some of the concepts outlined in here, and would also say that there's never been a better time to change. Our businesses have had to adapt this year to everything that COVID has thrown at us, and our HR people and talent functions have been in the driving seat when it comes to lots of those changes. So I'd encourage you to really try and keep the momentum for change, especially if this feels like the right route to head in. That said, we absolutely recognise that the removal of CVs is a huge departure from the norm and would be far too big an immediate change for most businesses. So if this is interesting but sounds like it might be too much of a change right away, it suggests looking at things like introducing it for early careers, where the CV will be less of a safety blanket for hiring managers, and the concept of hiring for potential is going to be much easier to explain across the business, before then, on the back of success in the early phases, moving into other roles if it's working well. Regardless, though, I think this brings out a few assessment best practice principles when it comes to hiring for potential. The first one is making sure that you have multiple assessments. So making sure that we have a multifaceted approach to the assessment, combining technology and testing with human assessment to get as many different data points as possible to best determine the potential of someone in the role. A word of caution when it comes to testing, obviously the tests that you're using, and if you're looking down the routes of gamified testing or artificial intelligence, the tests are only as good as how well suited they are to your role. If you're testing for the wrong attributes, you're not going to hire for potential for your role. It'll be hiring for potential for a different one, which doesn't really suit anyone. We also suggest here assessing real life problems that are relevant to the role and how they would respond in the future to certain scenarios, rather than being quite so centric on what they have done in the past. And when you are focusing on how they can use their experience, it's more in how they'd apply it in this role, rather than simply asking what they've done there. Other point around multiple assessments is making sure that we've got multiple interviewers to combine the judgment and assessment and make sure that there isn't bias creeping in, as well as providing the best candidate experience for the person that you're looking to hire. by making sure that they get to ask lots of questions of different people within the business in different roles. Second key theme here we'd look at is making sure that the process is really well structured. So ensure that you're following a really clear structure and assessment rubric that's based on what you're really looking for in each of your roles over that full long-term life cycle that role is going to be around for. So make it clear what you're looking for. Go back to the first principles as the first step in your hiring process, and ideally have a scorecard for your assessment so that you can really check back in on how well you're performing and how well candidates are performing throughout the entire cycle, rather than just making decisions based on performance at final round. And finally, as we've talked about a fair bit, looking at minimizing bias. We've talked about the bias that can come from CVs. This could also be from not having multiple interviewers in each assessment. And if you're not going to remove CVs from the assessment process, we could look at anonymizing CVs or other methods to look to minimize that bias. Bias is the enemy of predictivity. My colleague Frankie will share a link to our diversity hub shortly that has far more resources on this topic if you're interested in looking into how to make sure that your hiring is as diversity centric as possible. If you're looking at the assessment process as part of hiring for potential, the other big area that we'd encourage you to look at is your reporting. Ideally, you're going to be able to capture scores throughout every stage of the assessment process, collect in-role performance data from your review process, as well as any retention and specifically early churn information, so you can see how people are actually performing in the role, and then have a reporting suite that pulls from both your applicant tracking system, your ATS, and your HR information system, HRIS, and analyzes your assessment, how your assessment process is performing. Because if we're hiring for potential, we really want to be able to learn from how that potential is really realized in the role. The ultimate aim is to have a reporting suite that not only tracks who gets hired, but also how they go on to perform in your business versus their peers. With the right HRIS and reporting system, you'll be able to gather meaningful information about how the changes you make to the candidates that you hire impact your business's overall performance. It's easier said than done because it needs a fully joined up HR approach, but that's going to give you all of the information you need to draw meaningful conclusions about your own assessment process, and crucially, to work on improving it over time and not seeing it as a static assessment process that doesn't change as your business changes, to make sure that you're continually hiring for potential. So that's hopefully given you a good overview of how we think about assessing for potential at Instant Impact. I thought this would be a good juncture to hand over to Roger, who I'm delighted has joined us this afternoon, and will talk us through how the chemistry group think about human potential in the world of work. So Roger, thanks so much for joining us today.
No problem, Rob. Thanks for having me. Can you hear me okay?
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Well, thanks everyone for sort of listening in or viewing in. I'm not quite sure how you put it. I hadn't actually seen Rob's presentation before, so I'm kind of done. Thanks, Rob. That was everything I was going to say. No, it is actually a little bit of what I was going to say, because it stems back to the research that I first started before I started chemistry. And if we flick on, Rob, I'll just dive straight in. While I do that, I think it's important just to introduce chemistry. So chemistry are a company who's got a core piece of intellectual property that allows us to predict future human performance in the workplace. And there's about 60 of us. We're in London and New York. We work with global clients, and we're really solving three really main questions for our clients. And the first one, which we're getting some sort of fame for, or notoriety at least, is what does great look like? So we help organizations define the talent they need to achieve whatever commercial outcomes they need to create. And once we've defined that, and we use science and data to do that, so it's a quantitative approach to do that. And once we've done that, we help them understand the talent they have. So if we've defined the talent they need across their current organization, where are these people compared to where we need them to be? So you can develop and plan the development of your workforce in a more deliberate way. And then back to Rob's conversation, the other thing we do is, if that's the talent we need, how do we hire it? Chemistry has a sort of core purpose, which is chemistry exists to create opportunities for everyone to be brilliant at work. And we have a fundamental principle that we believe talent is abundant. It's only achievement that's scarce. And if any of you have read anything that I've posted, you'll see this all the time. My general frustration is when I hear of talent scarcity or a talent war, God forbid, that sort of piques me and sets me off, because our fundamental belief that talent is everywhere. It's just because we don't use the right tools or the right lenses to view it, we're walking past it every day. And going back to Rob's presentation, the tools we're using to assess talent have inherent bias in them, both conscious and unconscious, which means that we end up, as I say, missing out on talent. But let's go back to where chemistry and I started thinking about potential and potential in hiring. So if we pop on, Rob, thanks. So the first time I thought about this, actually, I was a global head of talent acquisition. So a lot like hopefully some of the people dialing in, I ran quite big talent acquisition teams for a global organization. And statistically, what I noticed was we weren't very good at it. Now, we were really good at hiring people. We hit all our hiring metrics. My cost per hire was in the right place. My time to hire was in the right place. And so from a KPI perspective, we were achieving everything that was being asked of us. Unfortunately, I'm sort of curious and a bit of a geek. So what I started to look at was actually what happens to the people after we've hired them. Do they fulfill their potential? Do they believe they've fulfilled their potential in the organization? And does the organization believe they've fulfilled their potential? I.e., did we hire the right person for the right role? And the data didn't lie. The data suggested it was a complete flip of a coin. And this was despite the fact I was using psychometric tests, I was using structured interviews, as Rob talked about. I was using assessment centers. You know, I thought we were pretty cool. And so this super worried me, right? So, you know, the job of a TA function isn't just to fill jobs, recruitment companies as well. It's actually to find the right person for the job. And we thought we were doing that, but the data suggested we weren't. And my affirmation on my, what's the correct word? I believe, and I've seen it in lots of client accounts, is actually that exists in most organizations. That inability to predict the future performance of an individual exists. And so I started a study. I went around the organization, and it's going to sound really weird, but I kept a language diary. And I met with people, and I noted down the words they used, how they used those words, the tone. If you'd gone back to my house, this was 1999 to 2001. If you'd gone back to my house, you would have seen big boards, and I ended up doing a lot of thematic analysis across those words. And basically, I ended up grouping the people into linchpins, presentees, and mood hoovers. And there wasn't really anything like A players. Engagement wasn't really talked about then. It was just emerging. And it was quite clear there was one set of one group of individuals who I described as linchpins. So those were people who everyone knew. They seemed to carry the rest of the organization, especially in the sales force. And actually, although they only made up 10 to 20% of the sales force, they accounted for 80% of the revenue number. Okay, so, you know, the offensive way that they were linchpins. There were another set of people that I call presentees. So they clocked in and out. They weren't sure if they were adding value, and the organization wasn't sure either. And so I wasn't sure whether they were netting out positive, very neutral language. So the linchpins had very forward-looking language, very positive, hold themselves account. Presentees, very neutral looking language. And then perhaps my favorite group were the mood hoovers, who quite literally were sucking the life out of the organization, and very negative language. Now, what's this got to do with potential, you may ask? Well, let's call these A players, B players, and C players. Okay, and I think the world of talent has assumed that you're either an A player or you're a C player. okay? And what we should do is find A players at all costs, because they're the right hires. What I noticed in talking to these people is that if I shifted a mood hoover from not talking about the company they work for, i.e. the company I work for too, but into some other aspect of their life, church, their children, their hobbies, their language shifted, and they exhibited the language of a linchpin. So that was my first big insight, which is there are no such things as A players, B players, and C players. There are just people who have found the organization and the role where they can fulfill their potential. Those are A players. And therefore, actually, potential's not fixed. There are not some people with potential and other people's without potential, okay? And that, for me, was a really big moment in my career, because I thought, actually, that's really interesting and runs against the tide that I'm seeing out there. That there are people with potential and there are people that don't have potential. My conclusion from the data was, no, actually, all human beings have potential. It's just the context that matters. And this is why, 9-box grids, where you have potential up the y-axis, performance on the x-axis. I find those things interesting, because in different contexts, I could move from the bottom left box to the top right box. The problem is, when you look at those, what you're actually saying is this person has no potential. And that's fairly damning in someone's career, as opposed to, okay, where in our organization would this person have high potential? Which is a totally different question. So why is it that we get stuck in these sort of dogma of actually no potential, A players? How does that happen? If you move on, Rob. It happens because, not because we're not using data, and I think this is back to Rob's initial presentation. If I break that down a little bit further, all organizations use data to hire people. We use the same data, we use data to promote people. The issue isn't that we don't use data, you all do. Back to Rob's point, we all interview, we use a CV, we might do some psychometric testing. Rob talks about cognitive ability, that is found to be more predictive than an unstructured interview. But if cognitive ability is not required for the role, it's not predictive at all. So you've got to make, I think it was the point you made at the end, Rob, which is the assessment's got to be relevant to the job you're hiring for. So the point is that we all use data. I can tell you right now, if we've not come in and done a what great looks like study, then the chances are 70% of the data that you're using to hire people or promote people has absolutely no correlation with the resulting performance that you're looking for. I'll say that again, because I think it's really important. The data that you're using today to hire and promote people, when you look at its statistical significance in explaining the performance of an individual in that role, our data would suggest up to 70% of the data you're using to make that decision does not differentiate performers in that role. It's a really important point. And I'm going to use a football academy. So just because it's something this nation cares about more than most things, and you would have thought with all the money in football in the Premier League, they would have figured this out by now. Well, the news is they haven't. Football still uses the wrong data to make decisions. So if we flick on, Rob. Okay, so one of the big issues with the way we hire today, i.e. that 70% of data, is it creates talent scarcity. So not being able to measure a human being's potential when you hire them creates a scarcity. Why would it create scarcity? So in football, for example, they have a total talent pool. And the total talent pool, honestly, is every male and female, but let's stick with the chaps. So every male that's born in the country has the potential to be a Premier League footballer. They've got, the right sort of attributes to be a male footballer. And then what the football system does is it then leans into 3 key data points, and only 3: physicality, speed, and dynamism. Okay, those are the 3 data points they use: physicality, speed, and dynamism. And that's how they identify talent. And I know this because my son was identified at 6 years old by Chelsea Football Club and ended up being a professional footballer. I see this happen all the time. The issue, though, is that what they're actually doing is narrowing the talent pool. And some of you might have heard of this in ice hockey. So, for example, at Reading Football Club, which is where we did this study, there was something like, I forget the actual numbers, but there was something like 150 players in the men's team, from the first team all the way down to 6-year-olds. So one of the stats we looked at was what percentage of those boys and adults were born between September and March, and which were being born between March and August. Okay, given that we're all born, the percentage that you'd expect some sort of mean average 50-50 split, it wasn't. It was actually only 10% of the players in that whole population were born after March. Right? Go figure. Okay, so how does that happen? Well, of course it happens because what they look for at the age of 5 or 6 is the biggest boys, because what they're doing is they're looking for physicality, speed, and dynamism. Well, because in our school system, obviously, the oldest children are between September and March. Therefore, what they're actually doing at the age of 5 or 6 is picking out the biggest kids and then putting the biggest kids into special training. So by the time the kids become footballers, they're all big, but they've all had exceptional training. And so you end up using this methodology, which literally rules out 50% identification, literally rules out 50% in this case of the population. One thing they could do, for example, to increase the potential of getting more boys to be footballers, is they could split the boys up by age, by size and height, up until the time at about 13, 14, where you start to normalize. So in this particular example, the data they're using to identify kids is halving, if not more, the talent pool available to them. And lo and behold, we don't have enough high-performing footballers. And you look at that and go, yeah, but that's football, Rog. They're not very bright. It's a machine. It doesn't happen in the corporate world. Oh, right. Okay, so Rob, if you jump on. Yeah, but it does, right? So it does. So this is another example of where our education system narrows the talent pool. Roughly, something like 1.5 million kids a year leave education. 50% of those kids don't go to university. So the system is already ignoring 750,000 kids. 37% of the 37% who do go to university, of the 50%, don't get a 2-1. Most minimum requirements into the highest sort of grad schemes, the biggest companies in the UK, is a 2-1. And I get that a lot of them, a lot of these companies have said, well, it's not a 2-1 anymore, it's degree level, and actually we'll do A levels. But watch the small print, guys, because if you look at the small print, what they're actually doing is selecting the kids who've got A levels, who could have gone to university, just didn't, out of choice. So actually, the headline's interesting. The small print is the interesting aspect. But we've got the same issue, which is instead of taking 1.5 million as the total talent pool and the full potential of that talent pool, we have a system of identification that assumes because I went to university and I got a 2-1, I'm smart. Okay, fair assumption. But they've also assumed you need that to do well in a job in my company. And our argument is, where's the data to support that? Let me give you a live example. There is a global graduate employer who has been a top 10 graduate employer globally for decades. They approached us and said, one of the things we're noticing about our graduate entries is that A, they're not very diverse. They all seem to come from the same backgrounds. Two, actually our ability to predict who was going to be a manager or a leader in our business, which was the purpose of the graduate program, it's an absolute sort of moonshot. We have no idea. There's no level of predictivity. And so, okay, we said, okay, that's interesting. And what we actually did, and this is where it comes back to the measurement of potential, they actually used, I was meant to be co-hosting this with YSC, and unfortunately the lady who was presenting it couldn't do it for personal reasons. But in that particular opportunity, Chemistry partnered with YSC because it was a YSC client. And what YSC had was a really good definition of what high-performing leaders looked like in that business. They knew their behaviors, they knew their traits, they knew their personality and motivations. And so what Chemistry did was said, okay, so if that's the end product, if that's what we need in the future, what is true of human beings when they're 21 or 18 to 21 coming out of education that could help us predict whether they're going to be high performing in this organization in the future. And we were able to identify the traits that were stable over time. So what was the implication of that? The implication of that was, for the first time in this company's history, it didn't go out to the 7 or 8 universities that we could all name, Russell Group universities. It went to 134 colleges and universities. We embedded what we learned about potential into an algorithm, and the assessment screened anyone who wanted to apply from these 134 colleges. So no uplift in number of recruiters needed, no uplift in effort. They could go to campuses they'd never been to before because they didn't need campus presence. And so they had the most applicants they've ever had. They were able to screen them effectively. And the impact was dramatic. So from a gender perspective, they had only ever been able to hire 31% of their graduate population at max to be women. For the first time ever, that hit 52%. So the actual hires they made were 52% women. There were more people of color and people from different ethnic backgrounds than they'd ever hired before. And that graduate pool went on to be the most productive and highest performing graduate intake they'd had. And so hiring for potential, i.e., we can't screen you on the skills. And by the way, what we found was that in the data, the university you went to was not predictive of future performance within this particular organization. Okay, so the key is in hiring for potential, if it's not which university you went to, what is it? And that's the process you go through. Do you want to flip on, Rob? Because I'm going to try. So we were first to this, and what was really quite annoying was that Google then say it and everyone believes it to be true, because I do, and we did before Google announced it. But there are two things that we found in all of our analysis. We found that previous experience and academic achievement are the two least reliable predictors of future performance. And bear in mind, Chemistry have determined what great looks like for NHS heart surgeons and nurses, and how many operations you've done and where you went to university was not predictive of mortality rate for heart surgeons when you normalize for patient acuteness. If you want to know what it is, you can get in touch with me. I know the answer. And so we've done NHS heart surgeons and nurses, salespeople, CEOs, actuaries, well, you name it, call center workers. If you want a job at a Pizza Hut in the UK, back to Rob's point, you'll be screened and assessed by a tool that we've developed for Pizza Hut. You do not need your CV. They have a completely CV-less process. You do not need a CV to get a job. Because what the assessment is looking at is what is your potential to be high performing in the context of Pizza Hut's consumer service proposition. And that's all it cares about. It's all it cares about. It doesn't care where you've come from, your degree, your educational background, your life background. What it cares about is, will you thrive in this environment doing this job we're asking you to do? So I'm going to finish. I'm going to do a few more minutes and then, well, I can keep going, but I know there might be questions. I don't know. Do you want to flip forward, Rob?
Yeah.
So the question then is, okay, Rog, if it's not academic achievement and it's not previous experience, what is it? And that's the question we get asked all the time. And this comes back to hiring for potential. The answer is it depends, because every organization, what great looks like, the profile of the talent that will flourish in their organization is different. And what you need to do in your talent acquisition role or your talent role or your HR role is help the organization determine what it is that differentiates people who flourish and perform well in our environment and those that don't. The good news is you have an amazing test population, because you will have people who are flourishing and performing well and behaving the way they should, and you'll also have a majority of people who probably aren't. And so you've got the data inside your organization to determine this. But what chemistry did, and what I did when I first started the company, was what we needed was a lexicon or a way of explaining to organizations how do you measure potential and current behavior. So potential in our world is really simple, and I think it can get super overcomplicated. It's merely your propensity to behave a different way in the future. So, for example, what's Roger's potential to plan really well, be on time, project manage really well? Well, to be honest, in the context of most environments, my potential is low. It's not fixed. I can do it. There's variance, but it's low. So how do we determine that? So what you can see here is chemistry's 5-box model. It's got intellect on the top, experience at the bottom. The thing that you can't see is it should have a line, and it's not Rob's fault, it's mine. It should have a line going from the top to the bottom, and at the top it should say hard to change. So if you're drawing this, feel free to draw it, hard to change, and at the bottom it should say easy to change. And this is the important thing, because back to Rob's point earlier about cognitive ability tests, chemistry see far too often that cognitive ability tests are being used, and when we do the statistical analysis of whether cognitive ability predicts performance in job, we find it doesn't. Now, in some instances it might do, but if you have not done the work to determine whether cognitive ability, and remember cognitive ability, verbal, numerical and diagrammatic reasoning, it might be just verbal, it might be just numerical, it might be just diagrammatic. To give you an example, there is a company that we work with who the hypothesis is these people need to be smart, and what differentiates our high performers is they're smarter than our mid and low performers. Well, in verbal and numerical reasoning, that's not true. They're all smart. It does not differentiate their high performers from their low performers. The area of intellectual cognitive ability that differentiates their high performers from their low performers is actually diagrammatic reasoning or logic reasoning. But that's just table stakes. What we found was all high performers had that true trait, and it was very different to the low performers. But there were other things that also predicted high performance, and those were in personality and motivation. And so what we find is if intellect is important, then back to Rob's point, you need to measure it, because you're not going to change it over time. Okay, so if I'm not going to, no matter what brain training, and I'm not unaware of the fact that, neural plasticity, even at my ripe old age, I'm just about to be 50. If I started learning the piano, there would be elements of my hippocampus that would start developing, and I'd get some neural pathways I don't have now because I'm learning a new instrument. The problem is the dedication I would need to do to change those neurons and that neural pathway is not something I get at work, right? In the time I'm in my work and the time I'm with an employer, if diagrammatic reasoning is important to predict performance, you need to measure it. And then personality. So intellect is, was viewed over the last few decades, your ability to take in, retain and process information. If any of you have got children, the general statement is as they storm through puberty, that processing power gets largely set. Now, back to neuroplasticity, there is evidence now that, if I play the piano, I learn something new, then my brain can alter. But that's the general view. So things like languages, for example, of course, I can learn a language at my ripe old age, but actually my accent will never be very good. For some reason, the science says that my ability to learn an accent like a native I get locked out of that beyond the age of 10, which is really fascinating. And so then personality is also very hard to change because it's very stable at a young age. Again, if you've got kids, the formative years are between the ages of 18 months and 8 to form my approach to risk, my approaches to socialization, my approach to how I make a decision. So we know those things are very stable over time, and by the time I'm an adult, they're exceptionally stable. And motivations, we have intrinsic motivations that tend to be relatively stable, and there's external motivations that can change. The point being, it's the combination of intellect, personality, and motivation plus context that allows us to predict your potential to exhibit the behavior in a new role. It is why I can hire someone with 10 years experience and they fail, and I can hire someone that doesn't actually have experience in my industry and they fly. And what we're interested in is, okay, why did that individual fail when they knew what to do? And the reason they would have failed was because they couldn't do it in my organization. And we see this often with startups who are trying to hire experienced folks because they think they need the experience, which they probably do. But what they do is they misalign on the culture. Their ability to assess whether that individual will have the potential to perform in their organization is the bit they get wrong. And we see this all the time. So in order to hire for potential, what you need to do is determine what does talent look like for your organization, and importantly, to achieve the outcomes you're looking for. Once you've determined that and statistically determined that using quantitative data, you can then feed that back into the recruitment process and go, okay, so if someone doesn't have the experience, what do we know about the individual's intellect, personality, and motivation that do these jobs really well? Because if we look at that stable thing, everything else can be learned, right? So you come back to this, don't hire for skill, hire for the ability to learn. And that's all that's saying is what we're looking for is someone who has the potential to learn the behaviors and gather the knowledge within our context. And that might be someone with 10 or 15 years experience, but it also might not be. And the problem with how a lot of organizations hire today is they over rely on skill or knowledge and then fire for behavior. And so what you need to be able to do is predict someone's potential to behave differently. So when you're determining what great looks like, what you're actually doing is you're determining the behaviors that are causal of performance. Once you have the behaviors that are causal of performance, then you can measure the intellect, personality, and motivation of a human being who's able to exhibit those behaviors in your context. Back to my Pizza Hut example, where we've reduced attrition across their estate by 20%. All we do in that assessment process is we measure their personality and motivations online in a customized, believe it or not, 8-minute assessment, okay, all done on your mobile phone. And then there is a short behavioral interview in the restaurant. And that's it, right? And that's it. So we've actually shortened the amount of time the candidate spends in the process while upping the accuracy of hiring high performers. Just because we've got crystal clear about what matters and what doesn't. And back to Rob's point right at the beginning, and I'll wrap up. The challenge is most of the data you're collecting doesn't actually give you any good predictive information on whether that individual is going to be high performing in your company. So that's sort of a very fast run through of 17 years of research and practical application with clients.
Awesome, Roger. Thank you so much. Absolutely fascinating. I took away a number of key sound bites. 70% of data, no correlation to explain performance in role is a shocking stat for all of us in HR and talent acquisition, and absolutely speaks to what we've seen as well. And I think the other one which really stuck with me there is the over-reliance on skill in the hiring process and firing for behaviour, which is a recipe for design. I mean, a couple of immediate questions. So a lot of the examples you gave us, whether it's NHS or Pizza Hut, massive sample size on existing performers from large employers. If you're a smaller business, hundreds of employees rather than tens of thousands, and you don't have as much data about what high performance looks like in role as where do you advise starting on this journey to determine what matters?
Really good question. So here's what I do, because it's what we do with the big companies, so you can just steal it and use it for your smaller companies, right? So get the influential people in a room, might be the hiring managers or the people who hire, get them in a room. Classic. Is that fire alarm's gone off in my...
Attention, please. Attention, please.
Is there a C player who's just burnt their toast somewhere?
It may. They're just doing an investigation. Sorry, guys. I can't believe it. Anyway, right. so get some sticky notes. Hang on a second. I can actually get rid of this, I think.
Attention, please. Attention, please. We are investigating an alarm condition. It may be necessary to evacuate. This
shows, Roger, why we all need to be working from home in these COVID times.
I know, I've gone into the office, and I know I've gone into the office.
You're giving us a good insight into why we don't want to be getting back into the office.
So look, I'm going to try and get through it. So what you have to do is take some sticky notes, sticky note pads, or do it on a Zoom and a Miro board, and ask each individual what they believe great looks like for their organisation. And get them to literally brain dump on each sticky note the one thing they think is important. So if you were with them, you'd see them have a whole lot of sticky notes in front of them. If you're not with them, on the Miro board there should be a lot of sticky notes, and you will have you will. I'm sorry.
We can hear you, so we'll push through.
Okay, it's really distracting for me, but I'll try. So you will have a lot of sticky notes around you. Then take the 5-box model, totally rip it off, guys. And
actually, I should have said, Roger, if there's a fire going on there, we definitely don't want you to stay on our account just to answer this question.
Sort of investigation. So take the 5-box model: intellect, personality, motivation, behavior, experience. Write it down, or I'll send it to you. And I've actually got this on a sheet, so if this doesn't work, I can do that. There's the alarm.
Attention,
no.
Please.
So
attention, please.
Then
please leave the building immediately.
I've got to evacuate.
Okay, Roger. We'll wait on bated breath. Could ask you for a follow-up that we could send round.
Of course, I've actually got this written down somewhere as a cheat guide for organisations that we don't work with. Cool. That will allow you to determine what you need to measure at the point of hire more accurately.
Yeah,
I'm really sorry.
Not your fault at all. These things happen. And Roger, thank you so much for joining today, and stay safe and get out of that fire. We'll circulate something around afterwards. So thanks for joining.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Just to quickly wrap up then on Roger and my behalf, I think really important that we're assessing what potential looks like in any role that we're recruiting for, and not just relying on the standard process that work elsewhere, because what potential looks like at Pizza Hut is very different from what it looks like at the NHS, but perhaps less obviously, it's also the same if you're a professional services firm versus the next one. The behaviors that we look for and the traits that are going to be successful in our organization are very, very different. So we need to go back to first principles. We need to look at how we can test for those traits and make sure that throughout the hiring process, we're laser focused on the things that are most important to us, rather than those 70% that aren't really actually correlated to performance, but perhaps make us feel better that we are asking some questions. So yeah, I thought that was a really interesting insight from Roger. I'm sorry he had to dash off with the fire alarm. Are there any other questions that anyone would like to run through at all today? I haven't got any coming in on the Q&A, so I think probably best that we leave it there, and I leave you just with a massive thanks for joining. This was our last webinar of the year, and ending on a slightly strange note with the fire alarm, but thank you so much for joining. Very much looking forward to our webinars coming up in the new year. Exact speakers to be locked down, but on the 20th of January we've got a webinar on building diverse leadership teams. We've got another one on the 28th looking at global mobility and an ultra flexible workforce. And then on the 4th of Feb, we've got executive diversity in investment management. There will be lots of further resources, and also watch this space because we're launching a new website before the end of the year. But it just leaves me to say a massive thanks, and James, to your point, we will be circulating slides and we'll be sending through the resources that Roger mentioned as well. So thanks guys, Merry Christmas from us here at Instant Impact. Have a great end to the year, and we look forward to seeing you in 2021.